Associative learning is when an organism can associate one stimulus with another stimulus. And a simple example is classical conditioning. Here we see the dog looking or smelling the food, and the dog begins to salivate. Now, psychologists would say the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation is the unconditioned response. But now let's come along and just ring the bell. So no food present, so sometime later we simply ring the bell. Now the dog might be interested, but that bell has no significance to the dog at this moment. We would say it's a neutral stimulus, and it's called the conditioned stimulus. Now the idea is, through this training procedure, we're going to try to get the dog to associate the bell with the food by pairing the presentations. So we're going to repeatedly pair bell and food. So we'll ring the bell, present the food, ring the bell, present the food. And so in the dog's brain, the idea is the dog will begin to associate the ringing of the bell with the presentation of food. And so if we do this enough times, at a later time, if we simply ring the bell alone, the dog will salivate. This is called the conditioned response. So previously the bell was a neutral stimulus. The dog did not salivate. The bell was not associated with food. But when we repeatedly pair the bell with the food, the dog begins to salivate to the bell alone. The dog has associated the bell with the food. At this point, the bell predicts the food. So this is a simple example of associative learning, and we can use LTP to help us understand what's happening biologically to permit this kind of learning. We'll take a simple diagram like this. We have two neural pathways that converge on a target cell. The food pathway, the unconditioned stimulus pathway, initially has a strong connection, right? Multiple synapses there on the target cell. So we would say this is a strong pathway. Presentation of the food by itself is sufficient to drive the target cell to a threshold, and we'll get activity in the target cell, which we're going to call salivation, the unconditioned response. Notice, initially, the way the wiring is, the bell pathway, conditioned stimulus pathway, is weak. So that's a weak synapse there. So activity in the bell pathway is not sufficient to drive the target cell to threshold. So we do not get salivation initially when the dog hears the bell alone. However, as we train bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, we go through the repeated pairing of the bell and the food. Then, after the training, we have a situation like this. The bell pathway has strengthened. We have more synapses here, for example. So now the bell alone is sufficient to drive the target cell to threshold, and we'll get salivation with just the bell. So by repeatedly pairing the bell and the food, we've created conditions to strengthen the weak pathway. You'll recall it's the food pathway that was strong to begin with, and so we will be activating the target cell. But if we are pairing the bell and the food, then the bell pathway is active when the target cell is firing, and that means we have the conditions for LTP to occur at those synapses. And what we're saying here is that actually the strength of the synapses is being increased, and in fact you can actually get the growth of new synapses. So a couple things to notice about simple associative learning. It requires the convergence of neural pathways. If we're going to associate the bell and the food, we have to have some convergence onto a target cell so that we can strengthen those weak synapses. The weak synapses are the ones that are representing the neutral stimulus. Initially, the bell had no sort of significance. It was not associated with food, but after training, the bell is associated with food. And secondly, that synaptic plasticity is the basic biological mechanism for how two stimuli can be associated. Changes to synaptic strengths is what underlies associative learning.